All right, everybody, time for the next lesson. We're going to look at energy and nutrients today. So let's talk about energy and nutrients. Let's talk about why you eat, why you get hungry. Well, we briefly referred to this in one of the earlier lessons, but we need to eat in order to get energy. We can't produce our own, so as a result, we need to eat things. We need to bring that into our bodies through food. Now, the question then becomes, well, where does that energy come from? Well, think about what we looked at for food webs and food chains, and we talked about producers and consumers. And the producers are able to get their energy from the sun, but we as consumers aren't able to do that. So, because we can't eat the sun, we need to eat something else that gets its energy from the sun, and that's our producers, that's plants. And that's because they are able to take the energy of the sun and actually store it in a form that can be used later on. All right? Now, we, as other organisms, then eat them, and we take the energy from them. Okay? So, let's look again at food chains and food webs, and realize we've said this already, but let's refresh our memories on it. So when we go from the bottom to the top of one of these food chains, we are passing along energy, and we're passing that energy along in the form of food, because in this simple little chain, the dinoflagellates are eaten by the copepods, and the copepods are eaten by the sunfish, and the sunfish are eaten by small sharks, and they're eaten by large sharks. All right? So by eating something lower on the chain, they're gaining energy. Now, a reminder again, producers, these organisms right at the bottom of every food chain or food web, are able to convert energy from the sun into usable energy. In other words, if nothing else on the planet existed and it was just all dinoflagellates, so if all of these were gone and there was nothing to eat these guys, they could still survive, because they could still get their energy from the sun, and they could live, and they could breed, and they could multiply, and they could spread out, and they could take over the planet, right? And that's because they are able to actually get their energy from the sun. They don't need to eat anything else. Everything else above it, and in this food web, everything from here up has to eat something else. So it relies on another organism below it in the web or in the chain in order to survive. All right, so those are what are called consumers, and they're consumers because they consume other organisms to get their energy. Now, how do the plants themselves get their energy, though? So I've said this a few times, that plants get their energy from the sun, but how? Obviously, this isn't magic. There's got to be some way that this happens. And that leads us to what is called photosynthesis. This is a word that you've probably heard before. You may or may not have learned a little bit about it before, and we're not going to go into any heavy detail on it. We're not going to look at the processes and where it happens. We're just going to talk about the general idea of what photosynthesis is. So photosynthesis is a process in the cells of plants and algae, and in some bacteria, that will take light energy from the sun and convert it into stored chemical energy. In other words, it's going to take energy from the sun and use it to make compounds that can store that energy. And those compounds are typically sugar or glucose. Right? So the plants or algae or bacteria will take the sunlight energy, and they will take in carbon dioxide, and what they'll end up producing is glucose, a sugar, and a lovely little byproduct that's important to us is they also produce oxygen. And that's because oxygen is actually waste. Right? We need oxygen to live. Plants give it off as waste. They get rid of it because they don't need it. So this is what this reaction looks like as a form of a chemical equation. Now, we haven't learned about chemical reactions. We haven't learned about chemical equations. So you don't have to worry about knowing what this kind of looks like. But what we're looking at and what we want an understanding of is kind of the general idea of what's happening. All right? So this big arrow means that this stuff is going to turn into this stuff. And we're going to ignore these formulas here. We don't even really care about that. What we care about are what the substances are. So what we start off with, and what plants start off with, and algae and some bacteria, is they start off with carbon dioxide and water, and they take the energy of the sun and they turn this into sugar and oxygen. All right, so plants take carbon dioxide out of the air, water out of the ground, and using the energy of the sun, they make sugar and they make oxygen. So that sugar gets stored in the plant, and that oxygen gets released into the air. All right, now the next question is, so plants make sugar, how do we get that energy from sugar? Well, we know we eat. So the question is, how do we get that energy from food into our body? Because if you think about what happens when you eat, you chew, and then it goes, down your throat into your stomach, and then goes on from there. And next year you'll actually learn about digestion and what kind of happens throughout most of this process. But it's just food. So what ends up happening? Well, what happens is that food gets broken down into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller pieces until we get particles or molecules that the body is able to actually take in to the cells and break down and get energy out of it. All right, so that process is what's called cellular respiration. So every, or pretty much every living organism has a process that is this or very similar to it, where they take in something like glucose and they break it down, and when they break it down, energy gets released. All right, so that's happening in you right now. Every time you eat, your body takes that food, breaks it down into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller parts until it gets small enough that cells can then take it and then break it apart and release energy. So what we have is a process that converts the energy that's stored in those chemical compounds, and it turns it into usable energy. Now, if we look over here, this gives kind of a visual representation of what's going on. So glucose, we have sugar, and the oxygen that we breathe in, both of these are necessary for cellular respiration. And when that happens, what ends up happening is we give off, as waste, carbon dioxide and water, and we get the energy that we need. Now, that carbon dioxide and water get released, and we take in sugar and oxygen. So this is what it looks like. So again, we're not going to worry about what these things look like, but what we're going to care about is what they are. So we take in, as animals that eat, or any other organism that requires energy has to do this, we take in oxygen and sugar, and we give off carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, this looks familiar. So let's take a look at these two processes that we've talked about. We've got photosynthesis here, where we have carbon dioxide and water taken in by plants, and they take in the sun's energy, and they make sugar and oxygen. And then the cells of us, when we eat plants, and plants will still do this too, they store energy and then they have to use it later. So they'll take oxygen and sugar, and they will make carbon dioxide, water, and release usable energy. Do you see something here? I want you to pause right now and take a good look at these two processes. This is photosynthesis. This is cellular respiration. What do you notice? If you haven't already paused, pause now. All right, so now that you have come back, what you should have noticed is that these two reactions are complete opposites of each other. We have carbon dioxide and water and energy going in to make sugar and oxygen in photosynthesis. And then the sugar and oxygen in photosynthesis get turned into carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And then we have that carbon dioxide and water that can be used again in photosynthesis. And the oxygen and sugar can be used again in cellular respiration. They will cycle, right? There is a balance here, and it is an important balance, because if that balance is disrupted, if too much respiration happens and photosynthesis can't keep up, that means energy isn't available for respiration, all right? So if that balance gets disrupted, then biodiversity gets affected. So if we lose a single organism, in a food web or in a food chain, that means that something will lose a food source, and something will lose a competitor, and something might lose a predator, and that will affect the balance. And if we have too much of an imbalance, if too many predators disappear, or too much food disappears, then we can destroy the ecosystem. All right, so that will lead us into our next topic. Our next topic is what is called cycles of matter, and we've already kind of looked a bit at one when we looked at photosynthesis and cellular respiration, but this is all going to be for next week. All right, so that's it for this week. There's a worksheet for you to complete for this lesson. You can find that in the assignment section. Submit it when you're done, and then you're done for the week.